Cole, Republican of Oklahoma, is now joining us from the Cannon House office building. And this is an appropriator and also sits on the Budget Committee. Congressman, let me begin with what the President had to say about sequestration, those automatic spending cuts that go into place unless Republicans and Democrats come up with some sort of deal. He said he's put spending cuts on the table, but he said there's also has to be new revenue and called for closing loopholes. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. Frankly, the President hasn't put forward a plan at all. And we've known this has been coming for 2 years. The House passed legislation in May of last year to deal with this. It passed it again in December. The Senate's never picked that bill up and offered a counter proposal. The President's never put one out. We're 2.5 weeks before this happens. Then he's off on a campaign-style trip to Asheville. So, the President likes to talk about a balanced approach, usually fails to mention he just got a major tax increase 45 days ago, no spending cuts, and that was a result of the fiscal cliff. And if we're really going to have balance, then these sequestration cuts ought to be dealt with, again, with alternate cuts redistributed, but not with additional revenue.
So, Congressman, does that mean that sequestration happens? And if so, are you concerned that jobs will be lost?
I'm extraordinarily concerned that jobs will be lost, but I do think it's very likely to happen. Again, the House has acted twice on this. The Senate's not done anything yet, although it appears to be rousing itself to action at the last minute. And again, the President himself has not put forward a proposal at all. It's nice to talk in vague generalities. This shouldn't happen. I want a balanced approach. I'd like to know what his specific proposals are. He just hasn't made them. Frankly, our suspicion is that the President actually wants this to occur, thinks it'll be politically advantageous, and then we'll probably try and negotiate something in March around the continuing resolution. But again, we'll see. I'd be a lot more impressed if this is an urgent crisis. You would think the President would be here convening a meeting at the White House to deal with it. He hasn't chosen to do that. So it suggests to me perhaps not as concerned about it or not as serious about it as he ought to be.
Are you concerned, Congressman, politically, that Republicans might get the blame if sequestration happens?
I'm actually more concerned about men and women who now are living with uncertainty, wondering whether or not they're going to be furloughed, what their job situation is going to be. That's the real issue here. And again, we've twice acted. Unfortunately, neither the Senate nor the President's chosen to do that. And look, we're willing to sit down with the President and renegotiate where these cuts go. We think that's actually appropriate. Across-the-board cuts are usually not a good way. And we would like to see a lot of these cuts shifted from discretionary spending into long-term entitlement reform. But again, the President doesn't seem to be willing to discuss that particular issue. So I worry about the impact of them, but they're going to happen. And just as I told my colleagues several weeks ago, tax increases are going to happen. They are written in law. These cuts are written in law, and it's a law that was advocated for by the President. The sequestration was originally his suggestion, and he signed it. And so far, he's offered no meaningful proposal to avoid the cuts. So given that, they're very likely to occur.
He signed the Budget Control Act. Did you vote yes on it?
I did.
So does that make it your responsibility as well?
It certainly does. That's why I voted twice to deal with it in May of last year, again in December. It's, all I can do is vote on the legislation I have. That's all the Republican House Conference can do. They've twice addressed it. You haven't seen a single piece of legislation to deal with sequestration out of the Senate. And the President himself, if this is as serious as he says, and I believe it is, then he ought to offer a specific proposal as to what he would do. Perhaps we could negotiate from that. But again, you can't call for a balanced approach when you've just had a major tax increase, income tax, and the end of the payroll tax cut holiday, and 45 days later call for another one. It's just politically unrealistic. So what we ought to do is sit down, negotiate, redistribute the cuts. There's lots of ways to do this that are much less painful than across-the-board cuts, and we ought to enter into serious discussion on entitlement reform.
Your reaction, sir, to the minimum wage proposal put out by the President last night, raising it to $9 an hour?
It's always easy to spend other people's money, and frankly, I think that's not likely to happen. I think Congress will certainly look at it because the President put it out there, but in my state, that would really hurt a lot of small businesses, and I think in the end it costs you jobs. What you do then is encourage businesses to automate and to shut down a lot of entry-level jobs. That's what most minimum wage jobs are. There's comparatively small number of adults that work them as a primary source of income. But again, I'm always willing to sit down and listen and look at the evidence, but I'm not persuaded it'll produce jobs. I think it'll cost jobs.
The White House cited research, according to the New York Times, cited research showing no detectable employment losses from the kind of minimum wage increases we have seen in the United States. The White House also pointed to companies like Costco and StrideRite, a children's shoe seller, that have previously supported increasing the minimum wage as a way to reduce employee turnover and improve workers' productivity.
Well, of course, if those companies want to raise wages, they can, and they ought to. If they think that's a good idea in their business model, I would encourage them to act on their own. In terms of the president's research, you can cite about as many economists on the other side as possible. But again, if the president wants to propose it, it's actually the first I've heard of him proposing it. I'm not suggesting it's new. I don't know, but it's the first time I've heard him talk about it, certainly in some time. I'm willing to look at it, but I think the more serious problems we have are deficits and debt and government, and that's where presidential focus right now ought to be. And I'd be very careful about encouraging anything that might cost jobs, because job creation has been abysmal for 5 years.
All right, David in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, Republican caller. Hi, David.
Hey, how are you doing?
Morning.
Thank you so much for taking my call, Congressman, and this very nice young lady. I study history quite a bit, and two things. President Obama is a very eloquent speaker, but couched in a lot of his speech last night reminded me of what happened after the Treaty of Versailles in Germany. You had the major public works program by Adolf Hitler, where they built the Autobahn. And then another thing in more recent history, when England decided to register firearms, and then they went and confiscated them. So these are some things that bother me quite a bit about President Obama and his platform. It bothers me very, very much.
Well, I think I agree very much with you, some of your basic points. I think the president does tend to look on government as the source of job creation. And actually, the private sector is the greatest source of job creation by far. And when you take money out of it, to spend it for other purposes, it usually slows the economy down. Low taxes and a robust private sector seems to me much more a reliable road path to growth. In terms of the gun issue, I agree with you, and very concerned. Again, I think sentiment on this tends to be less partisan and more geographic. It depends on where you're from. I'm from Oklahoma. Gun ownership is common. It's a hunting culture. Dad, sons and daughters and families grow up hunting together. So this is something that they're pretty skeptical about.
Congressman, do you believe, as the president said last night, do you agree with him, that these proposals, though, deserve at least a vote?
Oh, I absolutely do. Look, they send us up here to vote. So if you're afraid to vote, you're in the wrong business. And if you're afraid to state your opinion, engage in the debate. I noticed you had Keith Ellison on just ahead of me. Keith is a really great guy. He and I probably disagree on almost every issue, but he is eloquent, he's thoughtful, and he advances his position, and he's fun to have a discussion with. He's not afraid to cast a vote. I'd like to think I'm the same way, even though we don't agree. So again, I'm not concerned about voting on issues. I think that's how you define yourself over your career.
All right, on our line for Democrats, Claire in Noonan, Georgia.
Hello.
Hi, Claire.
Hi.
Good morning. I just wanted to say that I was very disappointed in the Republican rebuttal. It was seemed to me that it always seems that the Republican clan just doesn't want to have any kind of rapport with the president, to me. And at the same time, I was disappointed, concerned about this immigration reform. I was an adopted child who my father was very merited in the Air Force, American citizen, but myself he died before I could become a citizen, and I am a permanent resident, and it just seems like since 9/11, I'm not able to do anything. I'm not able to get any benefits anymore, anything that I need, especially since I've had a heart attack. And I just was concerned because they're always only talking about the border when there are so many borders that come into America illegally, and at the same time, the permanent resident I've been here 50 years now, and it just seems like they're making us also like as if we're illegal.
Congressman Tom Cole.
Well, first of all, thank you for the call and the personal story. I think that you actually illustrate a lot of the complexity around the immigration issue. But I'm actually encouraged on that front. I think the fact that we have 4 Republican, 4 Democratic senators working together, they've laid out a group of principles. There's serious efforts underway in the House. So there's a lot of different aspects to it. You certainly touched on one of them. But again, I think that's a chance for progress. Now, here I'll be a little critical of the president. When he was running in 2008, he said he would have a bill on the floor within 100 days. We're in the 5th year. We still haven't seen a presidential proposal. We get a lot of rhetoric, but I'm glad the legislative body is starting to move on the issue. There are places, I will say, where we do cooperate with the president. Look, I worked with the president on the fiscal cliff crisis and voted for the passage of the final deal, which was a compromise, and worked with him on Sandy relief, voted for that. And I'm trying to work with him now on violence against women, where I'm championing the tribal provisions in the House bill. So there are areas of cooperation, but again, there's going to be sharp disagreement. That's why we have 2 different political parties. That's why we have elections, and that's why we have debate and votes in Congress. It's a big country, 300+ million people spread across the continent. They have a lot of different points of view, and this is the place we work things out. And it may not always be pretty, and it may not always be efficient, but it's worked pretty well for 230+ years. So I think we're in one of these phases where there's a lot of differences of opinion amongst the American people. It's a pretty polarized electorate, but it's still our job to come up here and do the best job we can, try to find common ground, and certainly I'll continue to work with the president when and where I can.
Mary is in Cushing, Oklahoma, independent caller.
Hello, Mr. Cole.
Hi.
I'm calling about trying to get the Democrats and Republicans to work together. If you talk to the average man on the street that's a working Joe, he would love to see the loopholes closed. Why can't we just pass that little piece of legislation without adding and adding and adding on to it so that somebody can understand what the law is?
Well, I agree very much that legislation ought to be as simple as possible. And there's actually pretty broad bipartisan agreement that we need to lower the tax rates and eliminate a lot of the loopholes. Now, the trouble is always, what's a loophole? Well, there's some pretty popular loopholes, things like home mortgage deduction. I think that's a pretty good loophole. Most Americans do. People don't pay, taxes on their health insurance provided by an employer or by government. That's technically a tax loophole. Giving money to a charitable cause or to your church, you're not taxed on that. That's a tax loophole. So a lot of loopholes serve important purposes and are pretty popular. When you talk about them in the abstract, everybody's for closing them all. When you start listing off, and those, by the way, are the 3 largest loopholes, quote unquote, in the tax system, they're all pretty popular. So sorting through it's a lot more difficult than a couple of throwaway lines in a speech. Right now, we are working in the House Ways and Means Committee under Chairman Camp pretty hard to look at the tax system. We would like to have that discussion with the president. We can find some common ground on that. So as long as you're lowering rates and trying to keep it revenue neutral, that's a good thing. If you just simply want to raise taxes, we just did that 45 days ago. I mean, to me, how many tax increases do you need in a year? And we just had a pretty major one.
Congressman, what does President Obama need to put on the table? What are some things the Republicans want to see on spending cuts on Medicare and other programs? Specifics.
And I'll be very specific. On Medicare, and the president's put this on the table and then recently has taken it back off. I think gradually you ought to link the age of Medicare and Social Security and slowly raise them as we've done before. That's what we did, at least on Social Security, with Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. You have to reflect the fact that people are living a lot longer. Second, I believe very much in what's called chain CPI, that is reducing the rate of inflation in some of these payments. That would say it doesn't hurt individuals a great deal. It's spread over a long period of time, but it saves hundreds of billions of dollars. Personally, I think you ought to look at some of these programs on means testing. There's no reason to think Warren Buffett needs the same Medicare benefit, and I'm not suggesting he uses it. I have no earthly idea. That somebody that is basically got their Social Security check and nothing else. So those are, I think, three pretty specific suggestions. I can go into a lot more, medical liability reform, a lot of things I think we can do. But the real money, if we're moving toward trying to save these programs and make them stable, is on the entitlement side. We know if we do nothing, that in time Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security all go bankrupt. It's just a function of time. So you have to make some changes in those. We've put very specific changes on the table in the Ryan budget. I serve on the Budget Committee with Chairman Ryan. We've not seen specific proposals back from the president, or when they are, like point he was for chain CPI. Now, we don't hear too much talk about it. He was for raising the age gradually back in the 2011 discussions. Now he's pulled that back. But at the end of the day, if you're not serious about reforming the entitlement system, then you're simply never, ever going to balance the budget.
And as a member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, are you also willing to put on the table more defense cuts?
Yeah, well, we're doing that in sequestration. Now, to be fair, defense has been cut. We've already cut defense spending in the last 2 years over the next decade by almost $500 billion, $500 billion. And you can say it with money, and people, well, what does that mean? Well, right now there's 565,000 soldiers in the United States Army. In 5 years, there'll be 490,000. There's 220,000 Marines right now. In 5 years, there'll be about 200,000. We have 61 fighter wings around the world and in the country. In 5 years, they'll be down to 54. We were planning on having 313 combat vessels. Instead, we'll have 288. So we've made real and significant reductions in the military, and that's before sequestration. Again, when you're trying to get to balance, I think you're pretty careful about making any part of the budget a sacred cow. You've got to look at everything. Where we haven't looked is the non-discretionary side. In that period of time, there's been no reforms to Medicare, no reforms to Medicaid, no look at Social Security, and yet, we've taken a pretty big whack out of defense even before sequester. So I'm willing to look at it, but I think it's the president who tends to fence off parts of the budget as being untouchable, as opposed to Republicans who, again, also looked at Medicare and Medicaid in the Ryan budget and proposed pretty specific reforms. Now, again, if the president doesn't agree with those, that's fair enough. That's what we have a debate for. He doesn't have to accept them, but he ought to produce an alternative. And the same thing's true with the U.S. Senate. We really haven't done that.
Longs, South Carolina, our line for Republicans. Pat.
Yes, Representative Cole, I have a statement, then I have a question.
Okay.
I feel like the president lied to the American people last night when he said that the health care costs have come down, energy bills have come down. In South Carolina, and none of this has come down. I don't know what area of the United States he's talking about. But my other comment to you is, we keep hearing about cutting entitlements. When are y'all up there going to cut your pork spending and the wasteful spending?
Well,
Thank you.
Great question. First, let me answer it sort of in reverse. We have cut spending. Discretionary spending is actually $95 billion less than it was 2 years ago when the Republican majority came in. We're spending $191 billion less than the president has requested. We're getting ready to have an additional cuts. We'd like to distribute them differently, but the sequester cuts, I think, will occur and will stand. So there's been serious cost reduction. Unfortunately, we could do a lot better with a Republican president and a Republican Senate. The reality is we're a minority in Washington, D.C. We control 1/2 of 1/3 of the federal government. So, and I wish the election had gone a little bit differently last time. It didn't. I accept that. So we're going to continue to fight to reduce spending. I think we've been successful at that on the discretionary side, and hopefully sooner or later fiscal reality will force the president and the Democratic Senate to the table on the entitlement side. To your point